My daughter-in-law thought the reflection in the sliding glass door was just a smear of condensation. She thought 71 years of living had made my eyes cloudy and my hands unreliable. She was wrong. I saw the small amber vial tremble between her fingers. I saw the colorless liquid drip into my Christmas mulled wine. And when she turned her back to reach for a dish towel, I did the only thing a mother-in-law who had just written a check for $60,000 to save her son's crumbling marriage could do. I switched my glass with her mother's. You won't believe what happened next. But before I tell you how a woman who sat at my Christmas table ended up on my kitchen floor clutching her throat, let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect yourself from the people who were supposed to love you. The Tennessee December had laid a skin of frost over everything outside my kitchen window, turning the old magnolia in the backyard into something skeletal and silver. But the cold outside was nothing compared to what had settled inside my house over the last 6 months. A chill so precise and deliberate could only have been manufactured by human hands. I sat at the head of my long walnut dining table, a position I had held for 38 years. My hands were wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea. To anyone watching, I was just Margaret Calloway, a retired forensic toxicologist, perhaps a little slower than I used to be, perhaps a little lonelier since my husband passed 4 years ago. But my mind was a precision instrument. 4 decades of identifying poisons in dead people's blood had not made me careless. It had made me paranoid in the most productive way a human being can be paranoid. I was watching Sienna, my daughter-in-law, the woman my son Daniel had married 2 years ago in a ceremony that cost me $40,000, which I had given freely because I loved my son and I had believed, genuinely believed, that she loved him too. She was standing at the kitchen island with her back to me. The sliding glass door to the patio was directly ahead of her, its surface dark from the winter night outside. What Sienna didn't understand about that door was that it acted as a near-perfect mirror when the interior lights were brighter than the exterior. She didn't understand it because she hadn't spent 38 winters in this house studying every surface the way a scientist studies a specimen. I watched her reach into the pocket of her red Christmas cardigan. What she pulled out was not a lipstick, it was not a hair clip. It was a small glass vial, no larger than a perfume sample, sealed with a rubber stopper. The liquid inside caught the overhead light and threw it back amber and thin as water. My pulse climbed. I kept my face completely still. She worked quickly. One thumb popped the stopper. Her other hand curled around my wine glass, the one she had poured for me 20 minutes ago with such theatrical warmth. Here, Margaret, the good stuff. It's Christmas. I watched her tip the vial. 1 drop, 2, 3. She stirred it with her pinky finger. A small, almost imperceptible motion. Then she pressed the stopper back and slid the vial into her pocket in a single practiced motion. Practiced. That word detonated quietly in the back of my mind. She had done this before, or she had rehearsed it many times in front of a mirror, which meant this was not impulse. This was a plan. She turned toward the sink. Her back was to me for exactly 4 seconds. I know because I counted. 1, 2, the wine glass was within reach. 3, I stood up from my chair just enough to lean across the corner of the table. 4, I picked up my glass with my left hand and her mother's glass, sitting in the adjacent place setting with my right. Sienna's mother, Patricia, was currently in the living room arguing with her husband Gerald about the thermostat. Patricia was a loud, healthy woman of 64 who drank wine like water and had the constitution of someone who had never spent a day worrying about anything. She would be sitting down in approximately 3 minutes. I set my glass in Patricia's spot. I set Patricia's glass in mine. I sat back down. I folded my hands on the tablecloth. When Sienna turned around, drying her hands on a dish towel printed with Christmas trees, I was gazing vacantly out the glass door at the frost on the magnolia. My heartbeat was doing something athletic inside my chest, but my face was a landscape of gentle, aging calm. 38 years of testifying in court will teach you how to look neutral when you are anything but. Daniel walked in from the garage, bringing a gust of cold air and that particular nervous energy he had been carrying for months. My son was 41 years old and handsome in the way his father had been handsome, broad-shouldered, dark-eyed, with a jaw that looked decisive even when the man behind it was anything but. He rubbed his hands together and smiled at me. It was a smile with something behind it, something effortful. "Smells amazing in here, Mom. You outdid yourself." He came over and kissed me on the top of my head. The gesture was tender and it almost broke me, because Daniel didn't know. I was almost certain he didn't know. My son was not a murderer. He was something almost sadder. He was a man so deeply in debt and so deeply in denial that the woman beside him had seen an opportunity he couldn't even perceive. "Sit down, sweetheart," I said. "Your wife is almost ready." He pulled out his chair and sat across from me. He poured himself a glass of wine and I watched his eyes drift to my glass. A flicker of something. Was it guilt? Was it complicity? Was it just Christmas distraction? I couldn't tell. And not knowing frightened me more than the vial had. Patricia and Gerald filed in from the living room, settling into the seats I had assigned with place cards 3 days ago. Place cards I had quietly rearranged 40 minutes before they arrived. Patricia picked up her wine glass and took a large, enthusiastic sip before she had even unfolded her napkin. I watched her. I watched Sienna watch her. The dinner was a performance with 2 audiences. Sienna was watching me, waiting for symptoms. I was watching Sienna, cataloging evidence. Daniel talked too much, filling silence with anecdotes about his work in commercial real estate that no one was fully listening to. Patricia matched him anecdote for anecdote. Gerald mostly ate. He was a sensible man in that narrow but valuable way. It took 11 minutes. Patricia set down her fork. She brought a hand to her lips and frowned, the small, polite frown of a woman deciding whether to mention something uncomfortable. Then the frown deepened. She touched her throat. "Is the wine a bit off?" she asked, looking at her glass. "There is a funny aftertaste, like copper pennies." Copper pennies, metallic. My mind cross-referenced automatically. The symptom was consistent. Consistent with several compounds, but given the amber color, the rapid dosing method, and what I knew about accessibility, I had a working hypothesis forming. "It might be the vintage," I said pleasantly. "I can open a different bottle." "No, no," Patricia waved her hand. "I am sure it is fine." She took another sip because Patricia had never in her life left wine in a glass. Sienna was watching me. She was watching me with a stillness that was itself a symptom, a woman holding her breath while waiting for a reaction that wasn't coming. Every few seconds her eyes would drop to my glass and flick back up. She was confused. She was doing arithmetic in her head and the numbers weren't adding up. I picked up my glass. I brought it to my lips. I didn't drink. I just let the wine touch my mouth and then I set it down with the small sound of satisfaction. "Delicious," I said. Sienna's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I watched her watch me, and I kept my face open and warm and completely empty of everything I knew. Patricia set her fork down a second time. This time she didn't pick it up again. "I feel strange," she said. The certainty in her voice had been replaced by something softer and more alarmed. "Gerald, I feel genuinely strange." "Strange how?" Gerald asked, his fork suspended midair. "My heart is," she pressed her palm flat to her sternum. "It is going very fast, and my vision," she blinked twice hard. "There are halos. Gerald, there are halos around the candles." Halos, tachycardia, metallic taste. The hypothesis solidified into near certainty. I knew this constellation the way a pianist knows a chord. I had seen it in a toxicology report in 1987, in a case involving a man in Knoxville whose wife had supplemented his evening tea for 4 months before his heart finally gave out. The compound was derived from a common flowering plant, beautiful in a garden, catastrophic in a glass. Oleander extract, cardiac glycoside toxicity. Sienna stood up, her chair scraped back. Her face had gone the color of old plaster. "Mom, are you all right?" She moved toward Patricia, her hand outstretched, and for one disconnected moment the gesture looked genuinely caring. Then I looked at her eyes. Her eyes were calculating the distance between what was happening and what was supposed to have happened, which was happening to the wrong person in the wrong chair. "She needs emergency services," I said. My voice came out flat and clear and professional, the voice I used when testifying. Everyone looked at me. "Call 911 now." Patricia is showing signs of cardiac glycoside poisoning. She needs activated charcoal and cardiac monitoring immediately. Tell them glycoside toxicity, suspected oleander compound. Tell them exactly those words. The table went completely silent. Gerald was already reaching for his phone, his face doing the thing faces do when the mind hasn't caught up with the emergency yet. Sienna had gone absolutely still. Daniel looked from me to Sienna to his mother-in-law and back to me, the color leaving his face in a visible wave. "Mom," he said, "how do you?" "Call them, Gerald," I said. "Right now. She has approximately a 20-minute window before arrhythmia becomes dangerous." Gerald called. He stood up, knocking his chair back, speaking into the phone in a loud, fractured voice while the Christmas candles threw shadows across the ceiling. Sienna sat back down, slowly, like something inside her had lost structural integrity. She looked at her mother. She looked at my glass, still 3/4 full. She looked at her mother again. And then she looked at me. And for the first time all evening, her mask wasn't performing anything. It was just fear. Pure, absolute, cornered fear. "How?" she whispered. She wasn't asking about the poisoning. She was asking about me, about what I was. "I spent 38 years identifying what kills people," I said softly, picking up my napkin and folding it with precision. "I have known what was in that vial since you uncorked it at the island. I watched you do it in the glass door." I nodded toward the patio. She turned to look at her reflection staring back at her. "You should always check your mirrors before you do something you can't undo." The ambulance took 9 minutes. Those 9 minutes were the longest of my Christmas. Patricia was conscious but deteriorating, her pulse skipping and surging in ways that put a vertical line between Gerald's eyebrows. I knelt beside her chair and held her hand and talked to her in the calm, low voice I had used with frightened witnesses for decades. I told her she was going to be fine. I told her the paramedics were almost here. I told her the human body is far more resilient than we credit it. Daniel stood in the middle of the kitchen. He looked like a man whose house had caught fire while he was inside it. He looked at his wife. He looked at me. He looked at his mother-in-law gasping faintly in the dining chair with tinsel still draped across the window behind her. He looked like a man doing a terrible, slow addition problem and hating every number. "Sienna," he said. His voice was a sound I had never heard from my son before. Flat and ground down and full of a knowledge he didn't want. "What did you do?" She didn't answer. She was staring at me. "What did you put in my mother's drink?" He turned to me. "Mom, how did you know?" "She put it in mine first," I said. "I switched the glasses." The silence that followed contained everything. It contained 2 years of a marriage. It contained the $60,000 I had given to save that marriage, believing the debt was the problem and not the person. It contained my son's face doing the work of rewriting everything he thought he knew about the woman he had chosen. The paramedics came through the front door with equipment and noise and the merciful interruption of professional urgency. They assessed Patricia. They used the words I had given Gerald. They worked with the competence of people who know what they are doing, and I stepped back and let them. While they stabilized her, I walked quietly to the kitchen island. I found the dish towel Sienna had used to dry her hands. It was bunched beside the sink. I picked it up carefully, holding it by the corner, and I looked at the pocket of Sienna's cardigan where she was standing rigid near the dining room arch, watching the paramedics work on her mother. "Your pocket," I said. She looked at me. "The vial is still in your pocket. The police are going to want it. I would strongly suggest you do not make any additional decisions tonight that you will regret." She looked at my son. Daniel was staring at her, with the expression of a man watching a building come down. One of the paramedics asked if anyone else had consumed the wine. I said that I had not consumed mine and that the 2 glasses should be taken as evidence. I said this loudly and clearly, and the paramedic with the sharper eyes looked at me and then at Sienna and reached for his radio. The police arrived before Patricia had been loaded into the ambulance. I sat in my living room for the next 3 hours with a cup of tea that went cold. Detectives came and went. Daniel sat in his father's old armchair and stared at the Christmas tree and said very little. The ornaments on the lower branches were the ones he had made in elementary school, little clay handprints glazed in primary colors. He stared at a red one for a very long time. A detective with the surname Okafor, and the manner of someone who had heard every version of every story sat across from me with a notepad and a patience that I respected. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "walk me through it from the beginning." I walked her through it from the beginning. I told her about the glass door. I told her about the vial. I told her the compound I suspected and why I suspected it, and when she raised an eyebrow at the specificity, I told her my professional background and watched her adjust her posture by approximately 2 degrees in the direction of deference. I told her about the switch. She wrote carefully. She did not express surprise. Good detectives do not perform surprise. They just absorb information and write it down. "You believe this was premeditated," she said. "The motion was practiced," I said. "That is not a woman acting on impulse. That is a woman who had rehearsed." Okafor looked at her notepad, and the financial motive. Daniel made a sound from the armchair, a low, involuntary sound. "8 months ago," I said, keeping my voice even, "my son and his wife came to me with significant debt, joint credit accounts. A business loan Daniel had co-signed that had gone into default. I made the decision to help them. I wrote a personal check for $60,000. The understanding was that it would stabilize their situation." I looked at my son. "I have since learned that the debt is considerably deeper than what they disclosed. Deeper than Daniel knew, I believe." Daniel closed his eyes. "How much deeper?" Okafor asked. "I have an attorney," I said. "He has been conducting a quiet investigation for the last 6 weeks. He can provide documentation." Okafor wrote this down. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, looking up, "why didn't you come to us when you first suspected something?" I looked at her. "Because I needed to know," I said. "I needed to know for certain before I destroyed my family, and I needed the evidence to be irrefutable rather than circumstantial." I picked up the cold tea and set it back down. A dead woman's accusation is irrefutable. A living woman's accusation is a family dispute. Okafor studied me for a moment with the particular look of someone deciding what category to put you in. Then she nodded once and wrote something down. "They arrested Sienna at 11:40 p.m. on Christmas night. She had been sitting in the kitchen with a second detective for 2 hours. I could hear the registers of the conversation through the wall, the long silences, the occasional spike of her voice hitting a defensive note, the detective's measured, unhurried responses. The sound of someone trying to construct a story and finding that every door was already closed. When they led her through the living room in handcuffs, she looked at Daniel. He was standing now, his hands in his pockets, his face arranged into something that wasn't quite expressionless. It had too much pain in it for that. "Daniel," she said. He looked at her, he didn't speak. "I did it for us," she said. "We were drowning. You know we were drowning. I needed it to look like she was. I needed the inheritance too." "Stop talking," I said. She looked at me, not with hatred. With something more complex and less dignified than hatred. With a kind of collapsing desperation that might have moved me if I hadn't spent the evening watching her poison her own mother while she waited for the wrong woman to die. "You should follow the advice I just gave you," I said. "Stop talking. Get a lawyer. The one thing you have left to protect is your future, and you are currently eroding it with every word." Detective Okafor steered her gently toward the door. Patricia was in stable condition at Vanderbilt Medical Center. Gerald had texted from the hospital. They had administered the protocol. Her heart rhythm was responding. She would be monitored overnight, but the prognosis was good. Good was the word he used. I sat with that word for a while after Daniel went to his old bedroom, which still had a poster of a baseball player above the desk. I sat in the living room with the Christmas tree, lights blinking their slow, indifferent rhythm, and I thought about the word good. Patricia would live because I had spent 38 years learning exactly what kills people. Sienna had chosen the wrong house to do this in. 3 weeks later, I sat in the office of my attorney, Franklin Marsh, on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Nashville. Franklin was 70 years old and moved through legal matters the way water moves through stone, patiently, completely, inevitably. He spread a series of documents across the conference table. "The toxicology confirmed oleander glycoside," he said. specifically a concentrated suspension consistent with a deliberate extraction process. This is not accidental contact with a plant. This is someone who researched, prepared, and administered a compound with the intent to cause cardiac failure. He looked at me over his reading glasses. The district attorney is filing attempted murder in the first degree. The evidence is comprehensive. The financial records, I asked. Franklin pulled a separate file. This is where it becomes significantly worse for your daughter-in-law. He opened the folder. The $60,000 you provided was applied in its entirety to a debt your son did not know existed. Sienna had a secondary credit profile, effectively hidden, with approximately $180,000 in accumulated debt across 7 accounts. The debt is primarily attributed to a person we have been unable to fully identify, referred to in her communications as V. The nature of the debt suggests private lending at predatory interest rates. I absorbed this. She was being pressured. Almost certainly, Franklin said, which does not constitute a legal defense but does provide context for the escalation of the plan. He closed the folder. Her attorney is already constructing a duress argument. It will not succeed given the premeditation evidence, but it will extend the proceedings. What does Daniel need to know? Franklin folded his hands. He needs to know that you are not the only victim of record. The DA has charged Sienna with attempted murder of Patricia Hollander and conspiracy to commit murder of you. Patricia's family is pursuing civil action. Daniel is not a suspect. The evidence is clear that he had no knowledge of the plan. He didn't, I said. I know, Franklin said. He looked at me. How is he? Quietly devastated, I said, in the way that good people are devastated, without theater. Franklin nodded. He understood the distinction. There is something else, he said. He pulled a final document from the pile. Sienna's initial statement to police, before she stopped cooperating, mentioned that she had been told by a third party that your estate was considerably larger than what you disclosed to your son, that you had resources you were concealing from your family. I looked at him. She wasn't entirely wrong. Franklin waited. I had never told Daniel about the consulting work I had done for 3 pharmaceutical litigation firms over the last decade. Expert testimony in high-stakes cases where the science had been complex and the settlements had been larger than anything I had planned for. I had invested quietly. I had lived modestly. I had been testing, in a way that I had not fully admitted to myself until recently, whether the people in my life were there because they loved me or because they had assessed my value and decided I was worth managing. How much does Sienna believe you have? Franklin asked. Based on what she told police, I said, she believed I had approximately $4 million in accessible assets. And the actual figure is not relevant to the criminal case, I said, but I would like to make some adjustments to my estate planning, adjustments I should have made a long time ago. Franklin picked up his pen. Tell me what you want. I drove home through the January bare streets of Nashville with the heater running and an audiobook playing that I wasn't listening to. I drove past the hospital where Patricia had spent 4 days recovering, where I had visited her twice, and where Gerald had shaken my hand and been unable to find the right words, and had ultimately just gripped my fingers very hard for a moment, which communicated everything. I drove past the road that led to the church where Daniel and Sienna had been married. I drove home and parked in the garage and sat for a moment in the dark with the engine off. The house was quiet. It was always quiet now. It had been quiet since Robert died, but the quietness had changed character since Christmas. Before, it had been the quietness of absence. Now it was the quietness of something concluded. I went inside and made tea and sat at the walnut dining table. The place settings were gone. The Christmas decorations were gone. I had taken them down myself in the days after, working methodically from room to room, boxing the ornaments with the same careful attention I used to give to evidence. The clay handprints, the ones Daniel had made, I had kept those out. They sat on the mantel, above the fireplace. I looked at them for a long time. Daniel came for dinner the following Sunday. He came alone. He would be alone for a while, maybe a long while. He was the kind of man who does not move quickly through devastation, which I had always believed was a sign of depth and now believed more firmly than ever. He ate the pot roast I had made, and he talked about his work, the way people talk about ordinary things when extraordinary things are too present to address directly. We talked about a property he was handling in Franklin. We talked about the weather. We talked about whether the magnolia was going to need pruning in the spring. After dinner, we washed the dishes together the way we had when he was a boy. Him drying, me washing. The window above the sink showing us the dark back garden and our own mild reflections. I keep thinking, he said, about the 60,000. Don't, I said. You gave us that money and she had already decided. Daniel. He stopped. She was in a situation she had created and couldn't get out of, and she made a choice that was completely her own. What I gave you had nothing to do with her decision. People who intend harm find reasons. The money was just the reason she found. I handed him a pot to dry. You are not responsible for what she chose. He dried the pot, he hung it up. Were you afraid? He asked. That night, when you switched the glasses, were you afraid? I thought about it honestly. I was precise, I said. Fear comes after precision, not during. During, you are just doing the next correct thing. I handed him another dish. I was afraid afterward. In the living room, waiting, that part was frightening. But you didn't show it. No. He looked at me with the dark eyes that were his father's eyes. Where did you learn that? 38 years of looking at what people do to each other, I said. You learn to hold yourself very still while the world moves. We finished the dishes. We sat by the fire, and he had bourbon and I had tea, and we watched the flames for a while without needing to fill the silence. Before he left, he stood in the front doorway with his coat on and his keys in his hand, and he looked at me the way children look at parents when they are reckoning with the fact that the parent is a complete person, not just a role. I didn't know who she was, he said. I know, I said. That is the saddest part, and also the part that is not your fault. He nodded. He hugged me, and it was the hug of a man who understands that the person he is holding could have been gone, and is not, and that this is not a small thing. He drove away down the frost-edged street. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway in the quiet house, and I looked at my own reflection in the hallway mirror. A woman of 71 with silver hair and steady hands, and 38 years of knowing exactly what it looks like when something has been introduced into a system that does not belong there. I didn't look like a victim. I didn't look fragile. I looked like a woman who had done the next correct thing. The trial was 7 months later. I testified for 4 hours. I was a precise and thorough witness, which is to say I was the kind of witness that defense attorneys find extremely difficult to rattle, because I do not fill silences with nervous elaboration, and I do not take conversational bait. The defense argued duress. They argued that Sienna had been coerced by a predatory lender. They argued that she had been in a psychological state that impaired her judgment. They did not argue that she had not done it. The toxicology, the vial recovered from her cardigan pocket, the chemical extraction equipment found in the apartment she had rented under a false name 30 minutes from our house, the internet search history dating back 11 months, the recorded phone calls with the person referred to as V, all of it made the asterisk what impossible to dispute. They argued only the degree of culpability. The jury was out for 6 hours. They returned guilty verdicts on both counts. I was sitting in the second row when the verdicts were read. I was sitting next to Gerald, who had his hands folded in his lap and his jaw set in the particular way of a man holding himself together by will. Patricia was there too, recovered, upright, wearing a blue blazer, present in the room where justice was being administered for what had been done to her body on Christmas night. When the second verdict was read, Patricia reached over and took my hand. She held it. We sat like that while the judge began speaking, and the defense attorney began his motions, and the formal machinery of consequence ground slowly, irrevocably forward. I thought about the glass door in my kitchen, the dark surface throwing back the truth of what was happening 10 feet behind it, the amber vial, the drops hitting the wine, the 4 seconds. I thought about the switch. 3 seconds, soundless, the friction of crystal on walnut barely a whisper. One correct decision, made from 38 years of knowing what happens when you introduce something toxic into a living system and do nothing. After, in the parking lot of the courthouse, Daniel stood beside me and we watched the sky, which was doing something complicated with light and cloud the way Tennessee skies do in late summer. "What happens now?" he asked. "For you," I said. "You file the divorce papers, which your attorney has already prepared. You go back to work. You take the weekend in Asheville you have been putting off for 3 years. You eat the pot roast on Sundays." I looked at him. "You remember that you are 41 years old and that this is a chapter and not the whole book." He almost smiled, almost. "For you?" he asked. I had been thinking about this for 7 months. I had been thinking about it since the January night I sat at the walnut table and looked at the clay handprints on the mantel and felt the quality of the silence change from absence to conclusion. "I am taking a position," I said. "An organization that trains prosecutors and investigators in toxicological evidence identification. They have been asking for 2 years. I have been saying I was retired." I looked at the complicated sky. I think I was mistaken about being retired. Daniel looked at me. "You are going back to work." "I am going back to being useful," I said. "There is a difference." He thought about this. He nodded slowly, with the particular nod of a person accepting that a parent is a complete person with a life that extends beyond their parenthood, and finding, after the initial surprise, that this is good rather than alarming. He drove me home. At the door, he hugged me again. "I love you, Mom," he said. "I know," I said. "I love you too. That is why I switched the glasses." He walked back to his car. I watched him go. I stood on the porch in the late August warmth until his taillights disappeared around the corner. Then I went inside. I made tea. I sat at the walnut table in the quiet house, and I opened my laptop and wrote an email accepting the position. I pressed send. I looked at the glass door to the patio. The evening light was doing what it always does at this hour in summer, hitting the glass at the angle that turns it into a mirror. I could see myself clearly. A woman at a table with a cup of tea and a clear conscience and a great deal of work still left to do. I picked up the tea. I drank it. Outside, the magnolia moved gently in the August wind. Some people believe that age makes you harmless. They look at the white hair and the reading glasses and the careful way you lower yourself into a chair, and they write a story about what you must be. They decide you are a person things happen to rather than a person who happens asterisk to things. Let them decide. Underestimation is the most useful condition a careful person can occupy. If someone at your table has confused your patience for weakness, your silence for ignorance, and your love for a resource to be extracted, remember this. The most dangerous person in any room is not the loudest one. It is the one who has been watching the mirrors and already knows exactly what is in your glass. Hit like if you believe that wisdom is the most protective thing a person can build. And subscribe, because next week, I have another story about what happens when people forget that the quiet ones have been paying attention all along.